of talk about buyer agents and commissions, and I have a question for you. Do you know why the seller pays the buyer agent's commission? Most of the time, the listing agent will pay the buyer agent half of the commission. So where does this come from and why do we do this? Early in real estate, you go back to the 20th century and even before that, if you wanted to sell a home, you would hire an agent. The agent would list the home and then just sell it. It wasn't normal for the buyer to have an agent. That happened for a while. And then as the real estate industry grew and more agents became prevalent, so agents would tell other agents, hey, if you know anybody looking to buy a house, I will split part of my commission with you. So it always started off with the agent splitting their commission with another agent that brings the buyer. What's different between that and now? At that point, the agent wasn't representing the buyer, they were just bringing the buyer. And then the listing agent would close the deal. So they wouldn't always pay like half their commission. 1913, this is a very, very important date. The National Association of Real Estate Exchanges, which is now NAR, I'm sure everybody has heard of them a lot in the last couple of days. They standardized the commission structure where the seller pays a commission to their agent who shares it with the buyer's agent. So like you go back to the 20s, average commissions weren't that high. They were like 2.5%. That was about average, but the listing agent wasn't sharing that. 40s, commissions increased. They began to increase. Real estate began increasing. Demand for high quality real estate professionals began increasing. Real estate agents began sharing their commissions with other agents in order to increase exposure. Those rates naturally started to increase. It's about the 1980s that the industry standard for commission rates leveled off around 6%. And that's kind of how it's been, for the last 40 years or so. There was a Federal Trade Commission study in the 80s. It revealed that most buyers and sellers mistakenly believe, and this is interesting because they mistakenly believe that the agent working with the buyer is also working for the buyer, leading to a demand for clear agency representation. A whole thing for buyer agency representation really didn't become clear until like the 80s. So back in the 70s and before that, if a buyer would want to buy a house, they would just go to the listing agent, or sometimes a listing agent would point them in the right direction, but it was rare before that time for a buyer buying a house to actually have representation. And this caused a lot of problems, and this is why the commission study happened. After the 80s, the states began requiring real estate agents to disclose whom they're representing. That's where buyer agency became important. So the real question is, why did it keep happening like this? What was the reason behind the listing agent paying the buyer agent's commission? Well, there's incentive for broader exposure, right? If the listing agent has agreed to pay a buyer's agent, the buyer's agent is going to be more motivated to point the buyer in the right direction. More sellers started to realize that in order to get their property marketed properly, they have to play the game and they have to compete and cooperate with other agents. It became a norm. It became the expectation. It became understood. It helps simplify the transaction. And one reason why I think that, and this has been confirmed by other people, is that the financial burden of purchasing a home lies on the buyer. The buyer is the one that is normally financing. They're normally putting a large portion of their money as a down payment. They're normally saving for a long time to put as a down payment. And so it puts more stress on the buyer to be able to come up with that extra 2 or 3 or 4% in order to pay their agent. When with the seller is netting a large sum of money, typically based on the equity of their home. And so it's just a simpler way to simplify the transaction and to get the buyer agent paid. This is the norm. It seems to have worked pretty well. The challenge that is created is lack of clarity, especially when it comes to the consumer. Now, unfortunately, I don't know if a lot of real estate agents understand why this is, but it could be weirder. You could go to a country like the Philippines and find yourself as an agent in a transaction with 2 or 3 other agents involved in the transaction. How does that happen? Well, oftentimes the buyer is represented by an agent, the seller is represented by an agent. The seller's agent reaches out to their pool of agents and say, hey, I need a buyer. I've got this property for sale. Somebody bring me a buyer. And an agent would be like, well, I was with some other agents, and I know an agent that has a buyer. There may end up being a series of agents involved in the transaction. So that's why. So that's the reason. That's the reason why we do it like that. I hope you understand a little bit better why the seller pays the buyer agent's commission.